Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for attending and dialing in, and hope you learn a lot from this. And we just wanted to share some of our experience. We did have a couple folks who helped with this presentation who weren't able to make it today due to previous commitments. So we do have two recordings, though, that they sent in. And so we'll kind of get started with the introduction here from one of our classmates, Keith Sherburne. So I'll go ahead and hit play, and we'll listen to Keith that he pre-recorded for us, and then we'll go from there.
Leaders bring the weather. This quote showed up several times through the course of our lead experience, and we'll revisit it later near the end of this presentation. But through the talk, I encourage you to reflect on how this may apply to you, your workplace, and the NWS altogether. Now, my name is Keith Sherburne. On behalf of my fellow LEAD class participants, thank you for having us today and giving us the opportunity to share our experiences from LEAD. The aim of this presentation is to discuss several topics that we explored through each of the three phases of LEAD, along with some concepts and quotes that stuck with us along the way. We hope that this presentation will be helpful for those who are interested in fostering their growth and are considering applying for LEAD either in this round or in the future. Now, for me, I was surprised at just how impactful this experience has been and continues to be for me, both personally and professionally. With LEAD, you only get out as much as you put in. And as we'll discuss throughout the presentation, there are several topics that push your limits of comfort. But if you allow yourself to fully embrace the experience, you're going to feel uncomfortable, you're going to feel vulnerable, but that's okay. You're not alone in those feelings. LEAD provides you with a network of individuals that will offer you support as you go through this journey and be right there with you along the way, experiencing similar emotions, struggling with similar personal and professional challenges, but nonetheless striving for growth and progress, individually and for the Weather Service as a whole. So with that in mind, let's dig in. LEAD stands for Leadership, Excellence, and Development, but I'll note that the focus throughout the experience was development. We're all still learning, we're lifelong learners. I'll also note that this is not a management preparedness course. While some members of the class are already managers or will become managers, the objective is to instill leadership qualities in the class members so that they can lead the agency from wherever they are, regardless of their title. There are 4 phases in LEAD with different focus areas. Now, members of this class were selected in February of 2020. Obviously, COVID threw a wrench into our LEAD class experience. It delayed phases 1 and 2. It prompted an increased virtual component and ultimately directly affected phase 3. And because we weren't all able to meet in person until phase 2, over 2 years into the class, the traditional topic structure got adjusted a little bit. So there was some overlap in leadership within you, leading others, and leading the agency. However, you'll find that the general structure is still consistent with these phases as shown here. Phase 4, which is still ongoing, is an opportunity for us to collaborate on projects within smaller groups. Now I'm going to turn it over to the rest of my colleagues to lead us through a discussion about each phase.
All right, so we'll skip on down to phase 1, leadership within you. So that was Keith Sherburne from WFO Rapid City. So thanks to him for pre-recording that for us, and we'll move right along here. And then once I finish with phase 1, Jackie and David will take it from there to cover phase 2 and 3 before we wrap up with some of our friends from the Des Moines office, Alan Curtis and Brooke Hagenhoff, that will share their recording for the conclusion. So phase 1 topics. In phase 1, which we did virtually, but future classes probably won't need to do it virtually, we discussed the following topics here on this slide: core values, the strengths finder, which some of you may have taken before, emotional intelligence, accountability, negativity, and we crafted our own vision statements. And so we'll go through each one of these, but I want to just take a second to read this quote. If we hope to go anywhere or develop ourselves in any way, we can only step from where we are standing. So it's a good thing to remember. Wherever you are, there's maybe a long road ahead of goals you want to achieve, but step from where you are on that road right now and think about, assessing where you're at now. And so phase 1 really helped us do that. So with our core values, what are core values? Have you ever kind of sat down and thought about your core values and then written down what are maybe your top couple, top 3 or top 5 core values are? There are guiding principles, values that we can't let be violated. They're shaped by basically our whole lives, our childhood, the teachers and mentors we've had, the culture we were kind of brought up in and have been in to this point, family and friends, life experiences that you've gone through, and certainly our employees and our colleagues. And so on the right, you can kind of read there, those are the lead class core values that were established as well. And so every lead class and all the alums out there also have gone through this, follow these core values as well. So the Strengths Finder. The Strengths Finder is actually a kind of a, not a test, but more of an assessment you take to learn about yourself. And so if you've never done it before, it can be really enlightening, and it can really show you what your strengths are. And one thing we think about, ask yourself this question here, highlighted by Don Clifton. Are you building a career in life through attempting to fix your weaknesses or through developing and applying your strengths? Now, we talked about this during our class. And I know I, for one, have spent plenty of time looking at my weaknesses, trying to kind of lift those up and get better at those. And that is good to do, but did I spend the same amount of energy and time kind of captivating off of my strengths or using my strengths in places that they can be used well? And so we talked a lot about that and how to go ahead and do that as we kind of go forward in our own careers and our lives. Emotional intelligence, there's actually an assessment for this as well. And this kind of looks at your ability to understand and control your own emotions and understand the feelings of others and react to them in a suitable way. So much of this is about relationships and relationship management and having positive relationships with people and with a variety of people as well. So self-awareness is a huge part of this as well. Just knowing, learning more about how you kind of operate on the emotional side as well with your different situations you may run into, including conflict. So the higher the emotional intelligence, the more balance between the rational and emotional brains. Accountability. Talked a lot about accountability, especially relating it to culture. A lot of this slide, you can kind of maybe think about office culture. Is your office one that, we talk about in the belief section up here, admitting weakness is limiting versus a culture of accountability is one that we say we are all still learning. In terms of what's focused on, I really like the fault finding versus the fact finding, or who is wrong in the culture of blame versus what is wrong in the culture of accountability. So kind of a thought process, a mentality to how you approach things and how your office may approach things. And so if you look down below, the results, I mean, the bottom one there, lack of innovation is what results from a culture of blame. Whereas a culture of accountability, there's innovation that occurs. And so you can look through the other listed here. I won't read them all, but try to think about ways that we can help our offices and our agency be more on the right side of this chart in a culture of accountability. So we talked a lot about that. A lot of what we did in LEAD was interactive. This phase being virtual, we used those breakout rooms in Google Meet. We used them very well and very often. And so all these topics were very engaging, and stories were shared, and things were emotional and raw at times as well. And people were very open and vulnerable. No one was asked to share anything they didn't want to, though. I will say that. We talked about negativity. It's a powerful emotion. We've all experienced it. It's often rooted in fear. And this quote by Simon Sinek is a great one. If we fear our boss doesn't like us, if we are constantly worried that if we make a mistake, we will get in trouble, if we think that someone we work with will try to take credit for something we did or stab us in the back to get ahead, cortisol starts to seep through our veins. And so cortisol is a stress hormone. And some of that, some cortisol is not a bad thing, but too much of it certainly is. And so you can see on the slide here, a lot of that can lead to high blood pressure, heart disease, anxiety, depression, headaches, memory and sleep issues, and weight gain. So negativity is not good for our health, physically and mentally. So we talked a lot about, leaders bring the weather. We mentioned in the name of the slide. What kind of atmosphere are we bringing to where we work and where we live and where we are now? Vision statements. Again, just want to reiterate, so much of the course wasn't to just sit back and learn and watch presentations. It was engaging and interactive and really working on yourself. So a vision statement is a statement identifying your core values, your strengths and long-term goals. So after we had established what our individual core values are, and after we had taken the Strengths Finder test, it really helped lay the groundwork for us to develop our own vision statements. So think about doing that yourself, even if you don't do the LEAD program. What's your vision? Where do you want to go? How will you contribute to the agency, and who you want to become? Make it clear and concise and specific. And writing it down does actually increase the chance of achieving it by 42%. And for us in the LEAD class, we not only wrote it down, but one of the facilitators asked us to submit it to them. And it's not written on this slide, but submit it, sharing it with another person. Doesn't have to be obviously a manager or even a coworker, just another person. Increases your chance of achieving that vision up to over 80%. And so the facilitator that collected ours, they're going to continue to revisit those with us even after the LEAD has ended for us, and then give us opportunity to refine our vision statements as we go forward in time. We did do that in phase 3. We revisited it and kind of refined our vision statements as we wanted to. So it's a great exercise to do. And now I'll pass it over to Jackie to take us into phase 2.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sean, for passing that along to me. So I'm going to talk about leading others. This is a topic that we talked about in phase 2. So if you go to the next slide, Sean. So these are a few of the topics that we talked about. We talked about Myers-Briggs. We actually went through the assessment and did a lot of really fun interactive exercises to really kind of see how our differences and our preferences impact each other and how it might result in conflict, either at home or in the workplace. We also talked a lot about servant leadership, effective communication, listening. Diversity and inclusion was a huge topic that we talked about as well. We also talked about unconscious bias, subtle acts of exclusion, and then wrapped everything up with kind of leading with empathy. And the quote here at the bottom, all of us together are much wiser than any of us alone. So it takes a team to accomplish what we do here in the Weather Service. And that quote really kind of brings it all together, that we really need each other and we need to rely on each other. And that starts with good and effective leadership. Next slide, Sean. Thank you. So the Myers-Briggs test indicator, we went through the assessment. We took the assessment prior to attending phase 2. And as you can see, there's a lot of different combinations. And for those who have gone through the MBTI experience, you probably can kind of remember where you fall within this chart here. And there's a bunch of different variations between the different preferences that we have. But essentially, going through MBTI really helps you understand yourself, your motivations, your strengths, and areas where you have growth. And it's important to remember, if you haven't gone through the MBTI process, it's a really great process to go through. I found it to be incredibly enlightening for myself, both to learn about myself, but also kind of learn a little bit about how my preferences may stress out somebody else or lead to conflict, and how I can kind of work to better and improve that so that doesn't happen. And so one cool thing that we did with MBTI is we kind of broke up into groups, and we were sorted out through our different preferences and given different tasks to look at and work on, and then report back to the group. And you could really see how the different preferences, for example, extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, or judging versus perceiving, you could really kind of see all of the differences that really came out in these different preferences in that exercise we did, which was really, really cool to see. And David's going to talk a little bit more in phase 3 about the different facets of MBTI. So these are just, the basic preferences, and then he'll dive into a little bit more about what we talked about in phase 3 when we expanded on the MBTI process a little bit more. Next slide, Sean. We also talked a lot about servant leadership. And essentially it boils down to, leadership boils down to the 4-word job description: identify, and meet needs. So not only is leadership about leading an organization, but you have to remember that it's about taking care of people as well. We need to take care of everybody who's around us. And this kind of upside down pyramid to the right, on the right side of the slide here, the book that we read called The Servant really kind of flipped the mentality of how we look at organization within structures and how leadership works. And usually you see the pyramid is flipped with the CEO on top, then followed by the vice presidents, middle managers, supervisors, employees, and the customers at the bottom. But when we look at things from a servant leadership perspective, we flip that pyramid around. The customer is now kind of that top priority. Are we meeting the needs of our customers? Do we know the needs of our customers? And in our case, the public and our partners. Do we understand and are we meeting their needs? And then this quote here, the role of a leader is not to rule and lord over the next layer down. Rather, the role of a leader is to serve. So we're flipping the paradigm a little bit with this kind of top-down pyramid here, and kind of looking at how are we serving and how are we helping meet the needs and identifying the needs of those above us on the pyramid. And an interesting thing from a sociological study of people over the age of 90, what would you do differently if you had a chance? So looking back, most people over the age of 90 said they would have risked more, reflected more, do more that would live on after they're gone. So again, servant leadership, that was a big topic that we talked about, just how we're meeting the needs and identifying the needs of those around us and taking care of everybody. And one thing that we did that was a really powerful experience for me personally is we kind of sat down as a group and identified who was a good example of a servant leader in our lives, whether it be personal or career-wise, and we kind of shared that with the group. And it was a really powerful experience to really kind of think about who has designated servant leadership in your life. How did they make you feel? What did you take away from learning from them, from working with them, or if it was a coach, from training under them? And it's a really powerful experience to kind of think about who really embodies servant leadership within your life experiences and just how they made you feel. So it was a really powerful experience. And the next slide, Sean.
We don't have any reports.
We talked about effective communication, and I think this pie chart kind of says it all. When you think about communication, 7% of what words you're saying or typing goes into communication. So only 7%. And your tone of voice when you're presenting something is 38% a part of that communication. So again, if we're talking about communication in general, 7% of that communication comes from your words. 38% comes from the tone of your voice. Vocal or nonverbal cues, so body language, 55%. So the majority of your communication comes from your body language. And then secondly, the tone of your voice. And then lastly, the words that you're actually speaking or typing in an email. And so one thing I do challenge everyone to think about, if you look at this pie chart and we're looking at words as 7% of your communication, when we talk about email, you're missing out on the bulk of communication because you don't have the tone of voice that you're delivering that email in. You don't have the visual cues, the nonverbal cues, the body language that goes along with that message. So really, when it comes to effective communication, we have to have all three. You have to have the words, the nonverbal cues, your body language. If you could see me right now, I'm a little bit more animated, but unfortunately you can't see me. And then the tone of voice, how you're delivering that message is really critical to effective communication. We do have barriers to communication, whether that be physical barriers. I think email is a great example of a physical barrier. We don't have access to the tone that you're delivering the message to, and you don't have access to the body language. You're strictly down to that 7% with just the words. And then jargon. I think this plays a little bit more into when we're briefing our partners. You know, are they understanding some of the meteorological jargon that we're using? Maybe we need to cut back on that. So again, that's another barrier to communication. And then emotions, bias, prejudice, cultural, these are all communication barriers that we have to overcome. Next slide, Sean. We also talked about listening and how important it is to be a good listener. And this quote here really kind of sums things up. Listening is one of the most important skills a leader can choose to develop. And I emphasize choose because it is a choice. You can make the decision to be a good, effective leader or listener, or you can choose to, be distracted and not be fully involved within the listening process. And so a good listener is curious, not judgmental, doesn't have answers, or doesn't try to fix things, doesn't defend, doesn't interrupt or object, and doesn't critique. So they're just listening. They're curious about what you're saying. They're involved and interested in what you're saying. The speaker, when you're really talking to somebody who's listening, the speaker feels heard. They're understood. They have this increased feeling of safety, and quickly a way to build trust is to make sure that you're listening. Discovering common ground. Sometimes the speaker will become more open with you if they know that you're truly listening and involved in what they're saying. We do have barriers to listening, and I think we can all kind of relate to some of these, especially, the distractions. If we're on the ops floor and we're trying to multitask and get a few different things done, and the phones are ringing, there's a lot of distractions in operations. And so that's one thing that I think we probably can all relate to. That is a barrier to listening, those distractions. Your interest level in what that person is talking about. Perceptions, closed-mindedness, sympathizing versus empathizing. These are all things that are barriers to listening. Next slide, Sean. We talked a lot about diversity and inclusion as well. And one thing that we also talked about and really kind of emphasized was the idea of belonging. This quote says it extremely well. We need to do more than diversity and equity and inclusion. We need to create a real belonging in our culture. And as you can see in this chart here, when we increase belonging and we increase diversity and uniqueness, we feel included. You feel valued. You're accepted for who you are. And one thing that we talked about within this topic was how we welcome new people into our offices, whether it be a new hire or somebody transferring offices or moving offices. We talked about how do we welcome these people into our office? How do we make them feel like they belong from day one? So that was a really interesting topic of conversation that we had. Next slide. Unconscious bias. The mental associations stored in your mind without conscious awareness. So we all have this, we're just not aware of it. And so there's a few different types of which it can kind of manifest itself, whether you go with the status quo, this is what's normal, that's what we do. Confirmation, affinity, maybe we kind of gravitate with people who think like us. Gender, age, appearance, attribution, halo. We're a little bit skewed based on our good first impression, or horn, skewed by a negative interaction. So there's these different ways that unconscious bias can kind of manifest itself within the subconscious. And what do we do about it? First of all, you have to realize it and admit it, look for it, assess it. Then you can block it, which means you can educate yourself, seek different experiences. And, if we're looking at the selection process, maybe look at things from an anonymous perspective. And to count it, to check yourself, make sure you set goals and check your data. Check in with yourself, see how you're doing. The next slide, Sean. Subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions. So this kind of feeds back into the belongingness, and it also feeds back into the unconscious bias. So subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions are everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and insults that members of marginalized groups experience in day-to-day interactions. Now, these are oftentimes unintentional and reflect that unconscious bias that we just talked about. So there's a bunch of different themes, and we don't have time to go through all of those themes. But the one thing I want you to take away from this slide is somebody who experiences these acts of exclusion or microaggressions. This is how it may feel to them. You're not normal. You're inadequate. You don't belong. You are a curiosity. You're invisible. You're a burden. Or you're a threat. So again, there's a bunch of different themes that go along with these acts of exclusion and microaggressions, but that's how people who feel and go through and experience these acts of exclusion actually feel. And so that's a really important thing to take away. So keep that kind of locked into, the back of your mind when you may see yourself or see somebody else, unconsciously, putting somebody else down. So that's an important takeaway that we talked about during LEAD as well. Next slide, John. And one thing that we did, we were tasked with coming up with our own training session. So we actually trained and presented on a topic for the facilitators. And one thing that we came up with was leading with empathy to establish psychological safety. And we came up with a book that I don't remember who found it, but it was a really fantastic book. It's called Psychological Safety. And here's a quote at the bottom from the book. In a psychologically safe culture, team members are not afraid to express themselves. They feel accepted and respected. This openness creates a fertile environment for thinking, creativity, innovation, and growth, and leads to more collaborative relationships and an overall improvement to team productivity. And so the book that we read really kind of talked about the psychological aspect of feeling safe in an environment, whether that be at home or in the workplace, but again, just that aspect of psychological safety. And it talks a little bit about these different models, if you will, so security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, trust, and how it boils down to you. And the book actually talks a lot about how certain things can trigger certain people and how we can manage those triggers. And so this is a book that I really took a lot from, the psychological safety. But this was a topic that we discussed and actually led the presentation on for the facilitator. So that was a different task that we had during phase 2. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it along to David.
Thanks, Jackie. This is David Kramer here. For those that don't know me, I'm one of the 2 people that was selected for the Central Region LEAD program from Alaska region. So one of the cool things that you do get to experience as part of Central Region LEAD is meeting some folks from the other regions. I know that here in Alaska region, we just sent out our ask for applications for 2 more folks to go down to the next LEAD phase. So we're looking forward to that and just kind of broadening horizons about what's going on in some of the other regions around the agency. Next slide. So for phase 3, here's some of the core topics that we went through. And I do want to take a moment to point out that in phase 1, we learned about ourselves. And then in phase 2, we learned how to lead others. Now, as we move into phase 3, it's about leading the agency. And those topics that we hit on earlier in the phase 1 and phase 2, accountability, listening, emotional intelligence, empathy, and many others, we laid the framework early on in the phases, and we continue to build on those and grow. And then as we move into these ones in phase 3, we're applying a lot of those concepts throughout our phase 3 learning experience. So we'll step forward and dive a little bit deeper into all of these here. Slide. So as Jackie alluded to, we did the first round, step 1 of MBTI in phase 2. That's where we really look through the 4 dichotomies, what they are, how they interact with your personality, and as Jackie mentioned, how that works with your ability to communicate and the potential areas of conflict that could arise from those different types of personality traits. In phase 3, we go into step 2 of MBTI and break down all the different facets of those 4 major dichotomies. And as you can see on the slide, there's 5 different pieces for the introvert versus extrovert dichotomy, and they can vary pretty greatly throughout the different facets for different people. And this adds an extra layer of your ability to communicate, the ability to understand how you perceive and interact with the world, how you take in information and use that information when trying to communicate with others. And it gives us a deeper dive into ways that we can work to avoid some of the conflict that can arise very commonly from misinterpretations of how others are perceiving it, how their priorities are being established, what they're looking at as their main takeaways for a conversation. And once we start to understand this, what was really cool about the lesson is that it gives you very practical and applicable ways of working through some of these differences. It shows a lot of the strengths that we have based on the different personality traits that we have, as well as areas where we might stumble and have difficulties in our communication, leading to those areas of conflict. Next slide. One of the major topics that we talked about in phase 3 is courage. And this is one that really built upon a lot of the different lessons that we had built a foundation for in the earlier phases. One of the big distinctions that we learned about here was the difference between a good person and a courageous person. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but oftentimes we view the characteristics of a good person in a way that makes us feel that we are courageous when maybe we are perhaps not. Those are the 4 listed up on the top of the river of fear on the image on the right: honesty, morals, honor, ethics. And to kind of break down what that means is you can be a very honest person, but sometimes if you are openly honest at the wrong time and say something that is very true, it could come across as very mean or callous, or not taking into account what the current situation is, like certain things that you could say at a funeral perhaps. Being honest all the time doesn't make you a courageous person. It can make you a good person. Another one is we have a common saying, honor amongst thieves. Not always a good thing. So whereas some of those can be attributed to the actions of good people, we differentiate them from the things that make us courageous people. Doing what is right, regardless of the risk. Integrity is doing what is right when no one is looking. And these things build into the character of a person that can make them a courageous person. So we talked pretty deeply about how to get or grow from that good person to be a courageous person. And this is going to be, it's not a one-time thing. You cross the river of fear and end up as a courageous person for the rest of your life. It's something that we have to work at in many different situations. We cross different rivers of fear throughout our time. Many can be small and easier to overcome where the risk is low, and we can take an action that can change the way somebody is feeling at work, how somebody is being addressed or bullied in their workplace or at home life or whatever. We can cross those rivers of fear, and some can be easier than others. One of my biggest personal takeaways from this is that I think most of us default to viewing the river of fear and moving to be a courageous person as a singular event, meaning that it's something that we do on our own. We overcome this on our own. And what I realized from the lead experience was that it's not true. Most of the time, there are people with us as we are trying to traverse that river. The people that we meet in lead have become those kind of accountability partners for me, trying to make that change, to take the actions of a courageous person. We have our family members, our friends that can be with us through these times, and our mentors as well, that can guide us on how to navigate that river. They can't necessarily do it for you, but you also don't have to do it alone. And that was one of my personal takeaways from this. Next slide. Office culture was a big one that we hit on, and what that really means, what office culture is, how we change it, or how we maintain it. Now, the quote up at the top is a really good one for describing to us what office culture is. Group performance depends on behavior that communicates one powerful, overarching idea. We are safe and connected. And that's from the book, The Culture Code. And if you happen to read this book at some point, it really dives into the research behind that statement. And it's really pretty fascinating how they came up with that quote there. And throughout LEAD, we're pulling upon the different lessons that we had learned throughout all of our phases to describe what actions we can take to be involved in our office culture, because everybody that is in an office has a responsibility of what that office culture is and where it is going. So we learned different tactics of how to maintain a healthy office culture. And we also learned ways to grow a culture that could be toxic or negative into one that is healthy. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later when we revisit we changed the weather. Next slide. One of the big things that we did was 360 feedback, where we really take a look at ourselves from all of the different sides, i.e. why it's called a 360 feedback. Typically, these feedbacks are from supervisors, peers, and direct reports, and potentially even other people that are in your life. For us, this was work focused, so it didn't include family and friends. It included other people in your office, people that you work directly with as peers. Most of us didn't have direct reports, so we used the other lead participants in that category, and we also got feedback from our supervisor. Over on the right here is Johori's window, and what we're trying to do with this 360 feedback is make more things known by you and known by others. So moving into the top left corner of the graphic, into the open arena, and trying to minimize what is in the purely unknown. So this was a very difficult thing for a lot of people. You're getting criticism and feedback from a lot of people who have seen you work, things that you thought were in your facade category that were maybe in a blind spot category, and it really pulls out a lot of different things that challenge you, that work in areas that you thought you might be better at than you were, or pulling out areas that you are perceived as a lot better at than you feel, and maybe you feel some level of imposter syndrome. And then we take what we learned in this 360 feedback and work through it with one of our mentors. For us, it was Scott Tesmer and Valerie Gardner. For next lead phase, it may be some different folks, but somebody who's trained in how to walk through this so that you can find the areas of growth, find the areas of strengths, really get a better perception of what the different feedback means and how to better yourself through that process. Next slide. We also talked quite a bit about mentoring, and we did differentiate this from training and from coaching, both of which are also really great. It's not a choose one and that's what you're stuck with. I would recommend getting all of these things. They can all be very valuable for very different reasons, because mentoring and coaching are very different things and both have immense value, but they do address different facets of your work life. So for mentoring, we focused in on what it takes to be a good mentor, people who genuinely care about you, who establish psychological safety for you, people who are fully engaged. They're not always looking at their watch, waiting for the next thing or the next meeting. They are there present with you. They're safe and welcoming, and they create that environment and maintain that environment for the times that you spend together in your mentoring sessions. They're forward thinking. They're helping you develop ideas for the future, helping you walk through your different goals and making sure that they are achievable and how to find the best avenues to make or meet those goals. But they also challenge you. They'll push you to your limits and make sure that it's done in a way that you have the right boundaries to actually achieve what they're challenging you to do. And they're encouraging. They're not condescending to you. They're not tearing you down. They're not trying to just prompt themselves up. They're trying to bring you up. They're trying to encourage you to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And we had a unique experience in these different phases when we are present with the facilitators of the lead experience. We actually had a lot of opportunity, whether it be lunches, dinners, in between the different lessons, or finding time outside of the traditional course hours to connect with the facilitators that we had and get mentoring from this wide variety of amazing leaders around Central Region. And I would encourage anybody going into the lead experience to take full advantage of that and connect with all of the facilitators that are in your lead phases. And you can really gain a lot of really good mentorship and maybe even long-term mentors from that. They also taught us how to be mentors. Next evolution of our lead experience is moving into avenues where we can mentor the next generation and giving us the skills and equipping us with the abilities to be able to mentor people well. Next. Conflict resolution was a really big one that we talked about. And one of the really cool things here is that we got the opportunity to practice some of this as well. So we first learned a lot of different skills and strategies that we can use to help resolve conflict, but then we walked through ways of practical examples of how to actually practice these things and get them to be more habits as opposed to just different tools that we have learned about when we're actually interacting with folks in some of those tense environments. One of the really cool things that we did in phase 3 was when we walked through case studies that were all real life examples in our lives, whether it be work or home, of things that we could walk through, primarily focused on the work environment. And we were with a group of our peers and facilitators that we could actually walk through different cases where we're struggling with how to resolve different conflicts and get advice and feedback and be challenged and what actions we could take in a practical real world example of how to move forward and move through conflict and bring it back to a place where we improve that office culture to be a more healthy environment for everyone. Next slide. So some of the memorable quotes from our experience are listed here. We have a couple without the attributed author, but we couldn't remember. We heard them several times and not quite sure exactly who they all belong to there. One of my favorites here is "You cannot pour from an empty cup." To me, this ties back into the accountability that Sean was talking about from phase 1, where certain folks have a tough time saying no when asked to be of help. And there's only a certain amount of energy that any of us have. And once we start to empty our own cup, it becomes impossible to help those around us. And we can continue to try, but we are often met with more conflict or disappointment when trying to do that. And the accountability piece here is, one, holding yourself accountable to making sure that you have all the means that you need to be able to operate at a high level, but also having those people in your life that know you well enough to be able to tell you that you need to slow down or pull back for a time, that you need to recover and recuperate. We call them accountability partners, and that's one of the cool takeaways from our lead experience, is having people in a professional sense in our lives that can help do that now, where we can have somebody that says you're involved in too many projects and it's starting to show in either the quality of work that you're providing or in how much it's affecting your attitude, because you have just become so exhausted and burned out that you're not able to give forth as much in other avenues besides all the projects that you're on. And it's someone that we can trust, someone that we know is encouraging us to do better and really focused on our well-being as they see our cup being emptied. So that was one of the personal takeaways that I had from Lee. That was just a really powerful moment of gaining those people in my life that can really help hold me accountable to being able to maintain myself, but still extend out and help those around me. Some other great quotes here we had: "Don't let the start stop you." And then one from Heather that was, "If you missed the boat, it wasn't your boat." To try to avoid those areas of regret that we can often experience, or jobs that we didn't get or places that we didn't go, to just help reframe that into a way that can demonstrate a path forward that can really help us just have a better perspective of where we're moving when things don't work out the way that we thought they were beforehand. Next slide. So leaders bring the weather. We've talked quite a bit about what that means throughout all of these different phases. One of the main takeaways that we've seen here is, with persistent anomalies, the climate normals change with time. And this is where we tie back into office culture. Office culture is not something that you can change overnight. There are very few times that a grand gesture makes the big change to what the culture can be. A grand gesture may start the change of what the culture can be, but it very rarely actually has a huge impact on where the office culture is. Changes in office culture take time. They take many little actions over a long period of time and intentional choices to make change. The bigger the office or agency that you are trying to change culture in, the longer that will take. And having the right perception of that and what that looks like is really important for maintaining a level of hope and realistic goals and what it means to bring the weather. So we really try to frame what that looks like in a way that makes it achievable for us and make sure that we have realistic expectations of what we expect things to be. Saying one really cool thing or having one really cool idea may be the way the Weather Service is going in the next 15 years, but it's not happening tomorrow. And what we've learned throughout our lead experience and been equipped with are the tools to be able to make the marathon and not just the sprint. How can we make sure that we change the climate for the future in the ways that are going to make the Weather Service and our local offices as successful as possible? Next slide. So after phase 3, we jump into phase 4. And we have all been put on projects that will take about a year to accomplish, give or take, depending on the scope of each project. And this is where we bring back what is the benefit to the rest of Central Region. Central Region has invested all this time and resources into the development of our lead class, and now here's where we give back. We are going to be involved in 4 different projects, and we're all split up amongst these different projects. We won't go through all these in depth here, but I'll just read the main goal from each project. So project 1 is mutual aid playbook. The goal of that is to retire the concept of service backup and develop a playbook for delivery and reception of mutual aid between Central Region offices for all aspects of operations. Project 2, mutual aid DSS. The goal is to design a playbook that outlines how high DSS demand offices can utilize offices with lower DSS workload and provide opportunities they may not have access to. Next slide. Then we have Project 3, Mutual Aid Shared IT Expertise. The goal is to identify specific expertise areas of field ITO, increase field ITO collaboration, and improve and update the legacy IT checklist. And finally, Project 4, Regional Leadership Program Summit. The goal here is to develop a planned document to recommend how regional leadership programs can coordinate efforts and share resources to improve attendee experience across all regional leadership development programs. So if you happen to look back through this later, you can read through the different project objectives, or you can reach out to different team members on our teams and ask for more information through that way as well. At the end, we'll have a contact slide for a lot of our people in our lead class that you can reach out to for any questions that you have about lead. But here's our jumping point from phase 3 to phase 4, where we really move into the next level of our lead experience and what we give back to the offices besides the local leadership that we would bring to our individual offices that we're on, or other regional and national teams that we might be a part of. But here's a very tangible example of how we give back to Central Region from all of the time invested into us. Next slide. So to close us out here, we're gonna listen to a short video from Alan and Brooke, and they're gonna kind of start to wrap us up here, and then we'll end with some of the contact information that we have for our lead class. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. This is Alan Curtis. I'm here with Brooke Hagenhoff. We're both part of the Des Moines office and recent alumni of the lead class. And we're certainly excited to share at least our quick testimonials, feedback on what lead has been to us. You see on the slide there 4 other graduates, part of our class, and some of their quotes. So I think if you take anything away from this, just that it was a tremendous experience for all of us. But in general, if you know me or anyone does know me, and you're anything like me, I was absolutely at least a little bit skeptical about lead, both applying to it as well as going through it. And that's even after knowing and speaking to a handful of people that have gone through the program, both within and outside of my own office. But in hindsight, I think that was okay, and probably even a little bit healthy, that skepticism. But understanding that, I know it wouldn't have worked out if I didn't go into it at least with an open mind and willingness to critically look into the mirror, so to speak. So for me, lead was and certainly continues to be a lot of things. It's been exciting, empowering, lively, illuminating, kind of pick your own buzzword there. I think they really all apply. But on the flip side of the coin, it was also extremely exhausting and very uncomfortable at times. But it's also a space where I got to experience all of that in a judgment-free zone. And most of all, I think it's, for me at least, a community and support network that I'm going to be leaning on and into probably for the rest of my career. LEAD really is not your stereotypical leadership program. It absolutely is not handpicking people to become managers. Honestly, it really doesn't care if you even want to be a manager at any point in your career. Really, what it does is it helps you learn more about yourself, others, and really gives you tools to overcome hurdles you'll encounter at work, let alone everyday life.
You go into the LEAD experience with an open mind, it will change your life, and I know that it did mine. Like Alan, I went in not completely sure what to expect, but now I find myself not only with an array of tools at my disposal, but also an incredible support network to lean on. Leadership doesn't just happen in a black box. We need each other, and LEAD gives you that people to really lean on and support you, not just through the program, but through the rest of your career. It does take a lot of work, but you'll get out of the experience exactly what you put into it. So we encourage you to talk with LEAD alumni or facilitators if you have any questions about the experience. And remember that LEAD applications are being accepted through Sunday, November 6th.
All right, we wanted to share with everyone a quick list of the books that we read. It does seem like a daunting list to some, I'm sure it did to me. We did actually have a few extras in our LEAD class than what seems typical from most LEAD classes, just because of the extension of our LEAD program due to COVID, that to stay connected, we read a few more books that we could meet with and discuss throughout our time when we were waiting for some of the phases to be in person again. But all these books were excellent. They're all focused on leadership, but they come from such a different background and hit so many different themes that they are all very worth it. I would encourage you to read any of these books, but for a reference, here's some of the ones that you could check out later or ask us questions about. Or if you have somebody who was through LEAD in your office, you can ask them to borrow some of the books. Next slide. So we wanted to leave you with a list of contacts for any of us on here that if you want to reach out for any questions about what LEAD was, what it's for, what it looks like moving forward, what our different projects are, you can reach out to anybody on this list. This video is recorded, so you can check it out at a later time if you don't want to take time to write down people's names right now. Myself, I'm David Kramer, and feel free to reach out to me, and Sean and Jackie are on the call with us here. They're happy to answer any questions that you have. As Sean mentioned, Keith put together this presentation for us, so we want to thank him. And if you have questions about any of that, you can reach out to Keith as well. And Alan and Brooke were on the call too, and you can reach out to them. But anybody here in our LEAD class is happy to answer any questions. Now we have a handful of minutes, a little over 5 minutes, I believe, left. If there happens to be one or two questions that we could answer now, we are happy to do that. You can type them into the chat, or if we can get everybody unmuted, perhaps they could ask a question verbally too.